we decided to try a format that's unusual for us, not about science, but about the people who make it. And in today's video, we are going to tell you who one of the most famous scientists in the world was and how he lived. A man who not only changed all of physics, but also influenced many other fields he worked in. So, on March 14th, 1879, in the city of Ulm, Württemberg, Germany, a baby boy was born into a Jewish family. Because of the unusual shape of the back of his head, his mother and relatives thought that he had a developmental defect. Only years later did it become clear that a genius had been born into the family. The boy's name was Albert Einstein. His father, Hermann Einstein, together with his brother, founded the Munich company Elektrotechnische Fabrik J. Einstein and C.A., which mass-produced electrical equipment. In general, he worked as both a salesman and an engineer. His mother, Pauline Koch, took care of the household. And 2 years after his birth, another child appeared in the family, his sister Maya. When Einstein was 5 years old, he fell ill, and to comfort his son, his father gave him a compass. This instrument fascinated young Albert so profoundly that it is often said to have sparked his future love for the exact sciences and for all kinds of instruments. Despite his exceptional abilities in mathematics and physics, young Einstein struggled with other subjects, such as history and language. Even speaking was quite tricky for him. This continued until around the age of 9 years, when he finally began to speak in complete sentences. By contrast, at the age of 6 years, at his mother's insistence, Einstein began to play the violin. The violin became one of his great passions, lasting throughout his later years. He openly stated that if science had not completely absorbed him, he would definitely have devoted his life to music. Although at first playing the violin did not bring him much joy, later his love for the instrument grew so strong that hardly any of Einstein's trips took place without a violin, on which he played for his friends and family. His personal collection included up to 10 violins, some of which he bought himself and others that were gifts. One of his violins was sold for $516,500, although people say this amount was also linked to the instrument's possible association with Stradivarius. Einstein attended elementary school at the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, though he hated the school's strict regulations. This atmosphere made him feel tired and constrained. He often clashed with his teachers, who forced him to conform to the prescribed disciplinary rules. Around the 1880s, Einstein's informal mentor became Max Talmud, a Polish medical student who occasionally had dinner with the Einstein family. The Talmud introduced him to popular science books for children, which inspired Einstein to think about the nature of light. As a teenager, Einstein wrote what is considered to be his first major paper, Investigation of the State of Ether in Magnetic Fields. In the 1890s, after losing an important contract in his business, Einstein's father moved the family to Milan, Italy. Still, Albert himself remained in Munich, at a boarding house run by a relative, so he could finish his studies at the Luitpold Gymnasium. Later, when Einstein reached conscription age to avoid military service, he presented a doctor's note and, citing severe nervous exhaustion, left his classes and fled to join his parents in Italy. His parents were, of course, thrilled to see their son, but they were also deeply worried about his future prospects, which were now under threat because he had dropped out of school. Einstein gained admission to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic Institute in Zurich, thanks in particular to his excellent results in mathematics and physics on the entrance exam. However, he was still required to complete his pre-university education, so he attended secondary school in Aarau. Einstein lived with the family of a teacher, Jost Winteler, and fell in love with his daughter Marie. Later, Einstein renounced his German citizenships and became a Swiss citizen. In January 1903, Einstein married Mileva Maric, whom he had met while studying in Zurich. However, his parents were strongly opposed to this union because of the girl's ethnic background. She was Serbian. Nevertheless, this did not prevent the couple from continuing to see each other and to communicate by correspondence, where, by the way, many of Albert's scientific ideas can be found. Only after Einstein's father died was the couple finally able to get married. They had 3 children. The first was a girl, Lieserl, who was born in 1902 before their wedding. Ultimately, her later fate is not known for sure. There are at least 2 views on this. Either she was raised by Marich's relatives, or she was given up for adoption. The couple also had 2 sons, Hans Albert Einstein and Eduard Tete Einstein. The first became a hydraulic engineer, while the second was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In the end, the marriage proved unhappy, and in 1919 the couple divorced. Because of this, Mileva suffered a severe emotional breakdown, and Einstein agreed to give her any funds that a future Nobel Prize might bring him. Unlike Mileva, Einstein handled the end of the marriage fairly well, since he was finally able to begin openly building a relationship with the woman with whom he had started an affair shortly after marrying Marich. In 1919, the year of the divorce, Einstein married for the second time to his cousin Elsa Löwenthal. However, as is well known, Einstein continued to see other women throughout his second marriage, right up until Elsa died in 1936. In the end, the second marriage also turned out to be rather cold, even though Elsa took care of every little thing, every trip, every detail of Einstein's life. At a certain point, things became so bad that Albert seriously considered ending the marriage and declaring his love to Elsa's 20-year-old daughter. Only after Elsa's death was he able to understand the magnitude of his loss, as his emotional state at the time clearly shows. But let's get back to Einstein's professional life. After finishing his studies, Albert had severe difficulty finding a job in the scientific field for a while. The problem was that, while he was a student, Einstein became fascinated by advanced ideas in physics that one of his professors ignored. Albert was unhappy about this and argued with the professor, badly damaging their relationship. Unfortunately for Einstein, to continue his academic career, he needed letters of recommendation from his UNIY. And who wrote them? Yes, that very same professor. In all his responses, he gave extremely negative references regarding Einstein. Because he was unable to find a research position, Albert went on to teach at what was essentially a college-level institution of the time, and, in practice, became a school physics teacher. Eventually, in 1902, he took a position as a clerk at the patent office in Switzerland. For a scientist, working in the office turned out to be an excellent opportunity to continue developing his university research independently. During this period, Einstein had almost no contact with other scientists, but he already published 4 papers in the journal Annalen der Physik in 1905. The first 2 were devoted to the photoelectric effect and Brownian motion, while the other 2 described the famous relationship E equals mc squared and the special theory of relativity. It was precisely these last 2 papers that radically influenced Einstein's career and future scientific interests. In his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, Einstein first proposed the special theory of relativity, in which he explained that space and time are inseparably connected, and so he called this structure space-time. Einstein expected a stormy reaction to the paper from the scientific community, but that did not happen. Only a few scientists took an interest in his work, and broad acceptance took several years. In addition, in this work, he still neglected gravity, and that refusal to include it would not let him rest. Over the next 10 years, Albert worked intensively to incorporate gravity into his theory, studying advanced mathematics that did not come easily to him. In 1915, he completed the development of the general theory of relativity, in which he explained how gravity is connected to space-time. Overall, he considered this theory the culmination of his scientific work and claimed it had significant advantages over the earlier one. The new theory enabled the calculation of planetary orbits with greater accuracy, something Newton's theory could not. Finally, during the solar eclipse of 1919, Einstein's ideas were confirmed. But he made one mistake while developing the general theory of relativity, a mistake he later called the greatest mistake of his life. The thing is, the equations predicted a dynamic universe, meaning they said it must constantly evolve. At first, Einstein did not believe this prediction and remained convinced that the universe was static, in other words, unchanging over time. This belief was not scientifically justified. It was simply an unfounded certainty. By the way, it was not the only one. With black holes, there was a similar situation, which we discussed in one of our previous videos. I will, as always, leave a link in the description. To describe a static rather than a dynamic universe, Einstein added what he called the cosmological constant to his equations, intended to make the solutions static. But it quickly became clear that, even with this term, the equations still described a dynamic universe. Eventually, the astronomer Edwin Hubble concluded that we really do live in an expanding universe, and he and Einstein met in 1931 at the Mount Wilson Observatory near Los Angeles. At that point, the cosmological constant was thrown out of the equations, but it was still destined to return after the discovery of the accelerated expansion of the universe. The second of the papers that brought Einstein fame is the starting point of nuclear energy. In this paper, the scientist discusses the relationship between mass and energy and presents the famous equation E equals mc squared, which states that the rest energy of a body, E, equals its mass, m, multiplied by the square of the speed of light, c squared. This equation claims that mass is determined by energy, and that an enormous amount of energy is contained in a tiny bit of matter. Only a few years would pass before scientists learned how to harness this energy. In 1921, Einstein received the Nobel Prize in physics, but interestingly, not for the major theories mentioned above. Instead, it was awarded for his explanation of the photoelectric effect, since at that time his ideas about relativity were still considered questionable. He actually received the award only the following year because of inevitable bureaucratic delays, which, as we all unfortunately know, are not uncommon in Europe. In his Nobel lecture, Einstein devoted most of his speech to the theory of relativity. In 1922, a significant period of travel began for Einstein. Together with his wife Elsa, he set out from Marseille, France, to Japan via the Suez Canal, then on to Sri Lanka, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, and by March 1923, they returned to Germany via Palestine and Spain. In 1925, his travels continued. He journeyed through Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, where he gave his lectures. At this time, his diaries contain some rather racist remarks about Eastern peoples, which is actually quite strange, considering the strong anti-racist views he held at the end of his life. Meanwhile, the political situation in Germany was slowly growing more tense. Impoverished after the First World War and humiliated, the country wanted revenge, and the Nazi Party, led by Hitler, was gaining popularity among Germans. Einstein's scientific work was labeled Jewish physics, and he himself was marked for assassination. Many scientists who were alarmed by this state of affairs emigrated from Germany and nearby territories to the United States of America, including Einstein. After moving and beginning his new career at the Institute for Advanced Study, Einstein was pleasantly surprised by the opportunities for free thinking, which were very different from his previous experience. In 1935, he received permanent residency in the country, and 5 years later, he obtained American citizenship. For almost all the time he spent in America, Einstein devoted himself to working on a unified field theory. In 1939, Einstein, together with Leo Szilard, wrote a letter to President Roosevelt in which they warned him about the possibility that the Nazis might create nuclear weapons and suggested launching a project for the United States, to develop its own counterpart. Before long, the Manhattan Project was launched, although Einstein himself did not take a direct part in its implementation because of his pacifist views and socialist leanings. What is more, he aroused deep suspicion within the FBI, so he would not have been allowed anywhere near the project, even if he had very much wanted to be involved. After the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, Einstein became one of the leading opponents of the use of nuclear weapons. The following year, he and Szilard founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists. In 1947, in an essay for the Atlantic Monthly, he argued for cooperation with the United Nations to keep nuclear weapons as a means of deterring conflict. In the late 1940s, Einstein became one of the members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NOIACT, since he drew parallels between the treatment of Jews in Germany and that of black people in America. He spoke out for civil rights and called racism a disease in a speech at Lincoln University in 1946. After the end of the Second World War, Einstein continued working on a unified field theory and on key aspects of the general theory of relativity. Among his interests at that time were time travel, wormholes, and black holes, the very existence of which he, by the way, tried to refute, as well as the origin of the universe. However, at that point most scientists were interested in quantum theory. In the final years of his life, the scientist almost completely immersed himself in working with his colleagues and tried to avoid the public eye. Albert Einstein died at the Princeton University Medical Center on April 18, 1955, at the age of 76 years. On the eve of his death, he had been working on a speech in honor of the 7th anniversary of Israel, when he suffered an aortic aneurysm. Although he was taken to the hospital for treatment, he refused surgery, believing that he had already lived his life. According to the BBC, shortly before his death, Einstein muttered a few words in German, but unfortunately, the duty nurse did not speak German, so their meaning was lost. After the autopsy, Einstein's body was taken to a funeral home in Princeton and then transported to Trenton, New Jersey, for the cremation ceremony. Finally, it is worth mentioning a few interesting and rather popular facts from Einstein's life. For example, after his death, the pathologist Thomas Stoltz Harvey removed his brain without his family's consent, to preserve it and study it further. During his lifetime, the scientist had taken part in brain research and may, in fact, not have been opposed to having his own brain studied after his death. Einstein's brain is now kept at Princeton University's Medical Center. In accordance with his wishes, the rest of his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a secret location. In 1999, Canadian scientists who were studying Einstein's brain discovered that his inferior parietal lobe, which processes spatial imagination, three-dimensional visualization, and mathematical thinking, was about 15% wider than in other people, which may be one of the reasons for his exceptional intellectual abilities. And by the way, during his lifetime, Einstein deliberately gave up wearing socks because, as he wrote to his wife Elsa, he did not like the way holes kept appearing on his big toe. In addition, he claimed he needed 10 hours of sleep a day to function correctly, and his theory of relativity supposedly came to him thanks to a dream in which cows were killed by an electric shock. And of course, we cannot fail to mention the most famous photo of Einstein with his tongue sticking out, taken by UPI photographer Arthur Sassa during the celebration of the scientist's 71st birthday. The thing was that after he left his party in Princeton, he was surrounded by a crowd of reporters and photographers asking him to smile for the camera, but a tired Einstein, as a form of protest, stuck out his tongue instead. He liked the photo so much that he even ordered several prints and gave them to his friends. One of those prints sold for $125,000 at an auction in 2017. After the death of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, in 1952, Einstein became the first candidate to replace him, since he was considered the greatest living Jew. However, he immediately declined the offer, explaining that because of his age, he did not feel able to take on such a responsibility. It is also known that Einstein had a very negative attitude toward science fiction, believing it distorted people's understanding of science and fostered false illusions about things that simply cannot happen. Yet in the end, his very face became the basis for one of the most famous characters in Star Wars, Yoda. If you look closely at photos of Einstein and images of Yoda, you can notice that they have somewhat similar eyes, as well as similar wrinkles. That is all for now. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and leave a comment, and maybe we will release more videos dedicated to other great scientists. And if you did not like the video, then also write about that in the comments. See you next time.